Good evening and welcome back to the channel. Tonight on the Solo Gamers Club, we'll be taking a detailed look at a recent addition to my gaming shelf, Fire in the Sky, The Great Pacific War, 1941 to 1945. Fire in the Sky is a two-player strategic level game simulating the conflict in the Pacific Theater during World War II. The game was originally designed in 1999 by Tetsuya Nakamura, and this version was produced by Phalanx Games in 2019. In Fire in the Sky, the players control the forces of Imperial Japan or those of the Western Allies of the United States and the Commonwealth of Great Britain and the Netherlands. Alright, let's take a look and see what we get in the box. Very nice cover art. Box is pretty sturdy. Now, first we get some baggies, which is always a good thing. You can always use baggies. We have a rule book, and that is has a player aid chart on the back, 19 pages, full color, seems to be organized pretty well. A scenario book. Looks like we have a total of 7 scenarios. And that's 32 pages. There's an example of play. Player aid card, good cardstock. Reinforcement schedule on the back. And then we've got some cardboard. Five sets of cardboard. We've got some wood cubes, blue and white. Some cardboard. These are, I guess, these are some stands where you can have a secret composition to the task forces. And some dice, blue and white dice. And a battle board. Pretty nice. And finally, the map board. Take a look at that. Nice color scheme on that. We'll lay that out and take a better look at that. And here's the map board. It lays out pretty flat. Very nice color scheme. It's got some combat phase chart, sequence of play, and a track going around the board, all the bases, and then several boxes for port boxes and holding boxes. I have to say, very impressive production values. I'm very happy for this, that I bought this. Price on this was $57 US, and I got that from Amazon with free shipping. The game is played upon a beautifully illustrated map that stretches from the sandy beaches of the U.S. West Coast to the steamy jungles of the Indian subcontinent. The units represent the naval, air, and ground forces that participated in the campaign. Naval units are represented by square counters, and they denote groupings of several ships representing a pair of aircraft carriers or battleships, and divisions or flotillas of the other classes. Land units are represented by round counters, and they appear in regiment, brigade, division, corps, or army sizes, while air power is displayed as hexagonal counters, and it's abstracted into air points, and they're depicted as either land-based or carrier-based formations. The victory conditions center on the control of bases. Each base on the map is rated for its air capacity, land capacity, and port capacity. In addition, every base has a victory point value, which is represented by the yellow stars. Although this is a grand strategic level simulation, the design is structured in a way that has an almost tactical feel to it. The players have 7 scenarios to choose from, which range from a single battle to the entire campaign lasting from 1941 to 1945. We'll be playing Scenario 3 from Pearl Harbor to the Battle of Midway. Besides the standard victory points that are gained from controlling bases, additional victory points are earned during this scenario for damaging or sinking aircraft carriers. The Japanese will win if the final victory point total is greater than 35. The Allies will win if the final victory point total is fewer than 35. Otherwise, it's a draw. This scenario has some special rules associated with it. Gentlemen do not read other people's mail. Man, these decks are really hard, and Ranger to the rescue are in place for the Allies, and Longlands torpedoes and elite and not so elite pilots are active for Japan. Scenario 3 uses the same setup as Scenario 2, so the units are deployed according to the setup of that scenario. The game centers on the control of bases, so let's take a closer look at what makes up a base. Every base lists the location's air capacity, land capacity, and naval capacity. These values do not refer to the number of counters, but to the sum of transport factors of the counters present. As an example, take the base of Leh. It has 2 air capacity, 8 ground capacity, and 4 naval capacity. And these symbols are in the same configuration as the counters that they represent. Hexagonal for the air points, circular for ground points, and square for naval points. You'll notice on this naval vessel, that's the Repulse and Prince of Wales, it has a number here in a black flag, and that represents the number of transport points that are required to activate the unit. So in this case, the port of Leh has a capacity of 4 transport points, and that would be it would be full by just having the Prince of Wales and Repulse being stationed there. When an air unit is based at a location, it exerts an AZOC, or an air zone of control. It exerts that to all of the 6 hexes that surround that location. Air zones of control hinder enemy sea movement and cut supply lines, so they're extremely important in this game. Very important concept in this game is that Japanese units must spend transport points and oil points in order to move. Only Japanese naval units consume oil points. They consume them when the Japanese naval units move during operational movement or reaction movement. Allied units are never subject to oil points. Transport points are used to move units during the deployment phases and to move air and ground units during operational movement phases. In addition, the Japanese use transport points during the economic phase to move oil points from their captured resource hexes. The Allies have a fixed supply of transport points depending on the turn track. As an example, on turn 1, the United States has 24 transport points. On turn 2, it goes up to 28. Japanese points are limited to the position of their merchant shipping counter. As an example, on the first turn, the transport points, merchant, and oil points all start at 60. And then during subsequent turns, when the merchant shipping counter is being moved down the track, that'll be the maximum amount of transport points that the Japanese will have for that turn. So you'll find out that during the course of the game, U.S. submarine activity will have a very large effect on the number of merchant points and therefore the number of transport points that the Japanese will have available to them. You'll notice that the merchantman counter is twice as long as a normal counter, and that's for a reason, and that is to remind the Japanese player that every time a merchant point is lost to submarine activity, it moves down 2 points rather than 1. So it's going to start at 60. If a hit was inflicted on their merchant marine fleet, it will go down to 58. Every game turn is comprised of 2 parts, a Japanese sequence and an Allied sequence. Each of those sequences is broken down into 10 phases: an economic phase, reinforcement phase, first deployment, operational, reaction, air commitment, combat, return to base, second deployment, and end phase. Most important of these steps is the deployment and operational and reaction phases. The deployment phase can be thought of as a strategic redeployment, where units are moved from their permanent bases to forward bases under friendly control, or they'll prepare for operational movement. Units moving during these phases may not enter AZOCs. In the operational movement phase, units are formed into task forces and moved to neutral or enemy-controlled bases. Naval units may move up to their movement allowance, while other units are limited to a maximum of 4 hexes. In the reaction phase, the non-phasing player may form task forces and move them up to 1/2 of their movement allowances into hexes with enemy units. During the air commitment phase, the phasing player will declare which hexes his air units will commit to in the coming combat phase. These units may attack enemy naval and air units or support land combat. Air units are either committed to the hex they occupy or an adjacent hex. They should be positioned within the hex accordingly to show their status. Combat phase is resolved by the phasing player, and those combats can be resolved in any order that they choose. And the combat phase includes a submarine attack segment followed by a battle segment, and then finally damage resolution. The easiest way to teach the game is to play through a turn. The rules are easy to understand and are procedural in nature, which facilitates solitaire play. Most important rules to remember are those of the stacking rules, in that they're based on transport points rather than the number of counters in the space. This is different from most games, and it takes a little bit to get used to. We'll begin with the economic phase of the Japanese turn. During this phase, the Japanese will transport their oil from their captured resource hexes and also transfer destroyers to the Japanese convoy escort box. As this is the first turn, the Japanese have not secured any resource hexes, so there won't be any oil transport, but they are able to transfer destroyers to the convoy escort box. Each destroyer that we transfer to the convoy escort box costs 2 transport points to move. And we're going to do that. We're going to move a destroyer from the Formosa box to the Japanese convoy escort box. The unit is activated and transferred to the convoy escort box. Now that's going to cost 2 transport points. So we'll move the Japanese transport marker from 60 to 58. The next phase is the reinforcement phase. Now, as this is turn 1, there will be no reinforcements, but we do reset the submarine and transport points to those listed on the turn track. So in this case, the Japanese transport marker will be moved to be equal with the merchant counter that is on the board. Merchantman counter is at 60, so we're going to move the transport marker to 60 as well. Japanese submarine points are always reset to 2. They will never have any more or less during the campaign. But the Allies, or I should say the US, have a variable amount of sub points. On the board, on the turn track, you'll see that during turn 1, the US has 2 sub points. By turn 6, they move up to 4, and then turn 10, they move up to 6, and so on. And now we'll move on to the first deployment phase. Deployment phases utilize 2 types of movement. Either a 1-hex deployment, which allows a unit to move to an adjacent hex for 0 transport points, or C deployment, which the unit would have to spend transport points equal to its transport point listing on the counter. Our first move is going to utilize 1-hex deployment, and on this hex in Saigon, you'll notice that there's a small road connection that leads into Bangkok, and that allows a land unit to utilize a 1-hex deployment. So we're going to do that. We're going to activate that 15th Army in Saigon, and we're going to move that to Bangkok. That is a neutral base, and it is not in an enemy zone of control. So the 15th Army moves from Saigon into Bangkok. Our next movement is going to take place in the port of Palau, where we're going to move the light carrier Zuho and a destroyer flotilla from Palau to the Marianas Islands. Oil is not consumed by the Japanese during a deployment phase, but transport points are. So what we do is we look at the transport point cost of the units that we plan on moving, in this case 2 for the light carrier and 1 for the destroyer, and we pay those transport costs, and then we're allowed to move the unit up to 4 spaces. So in this case, the light carrier and the destroyer will move 2 hexes northeast to the Marianas. And this force is going to be a covering force for our invasion forces for the Wake Island invasion, which is going to be attempted by the forces we have in Iwo Jima, the Special Naval Landing Force Brigade and a destroyer escort. So we'll move the Japanese transport marker from 60 down to 57. And that will pay the cost for the transference of the carrier and destroyer flotilla. And that's going to complete the movements that I have intended for the Japanese during the first deployment. We'll move on to the operational phase. This scenario has several special rules associated with it. One of them is Rule 1. It regards Japanese pre-war logistical preparations. And this special rule allows the Japanese player to move a task force anywhere on the map by spending only oil points equal to their transport ratings of the units involved. And we're going to use this special rule to form the Kido Butai. The Kido Butai, or mobile force, consists of 3 fleet carrier arms with a destroyer escort. It consists of the Hiryu, Shokaku, and the Kaga, along with a destroyer escort. We're going to activate that force by paying the transport point costs of each of the units involved, and we're going to form that into a special task force. During an operational phase, the Japanese pay oil points for naval units. So in this case, this force will cost us a total of 12 oil points, the summation of their transport points listed on the counters. The counters are inverted to their operational sides, and they're going to make a movement from Yokosuka Naval Yard to Pearl Harbor, and this will form our Pearl Harbor strike force. The units are placed from the Yokosuka holding box to the Yokosuka hex on the board, and then they're moved towards Pearl Harbor, and the only condition is we don't want to enter any air zones of control. And finally, they arrive at the Pearl Harbor hex where they intend to launch a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And the Japanese oil points are moved from 60 down to 48 to reflect the cost. Next, we're going to activate forces for our Manila invasion force. That's going to consist of the 14th Army, supported by the heavy cruiser Furataka and a destroyer flotilla. The naval units are inverted to their active sides, and the forces moved one hex to the Manila hex. During the operation phase, land and air units that are moving by sea have to pay twice the amount of their listed transport points. So in this case, the 14th Army will cost us 16 transport points, and the naval units will cost us a total of 3, 2 for the cruiser, 1 for the destroyer. The oil marker is moved from 48 down to 45, and the transport marker moves from 57 down to 41. As you can see, the transport points are very important in this game. Next is our Rabaul invasion force. We're going to be taking the heavy cruiser Takeo and a destroyer escort, along with the Ichiki Brigade located in Truk. Those units will be activated, and that'll cost us a total of 4 transport points for the brigade and 3 oil points for the naval forces. Forces will move 2 hexes south to the Rabaul invasion zone. And we'll deduct the corresponding transport and oil points accordingly. That leaves Japan with 37 transport points and 42 oil. Next, we'll switch to the Marshall Islands, where we're going to activate a destroyer flotilla and the Nankai Brigade. They are going to invade the Gilberts. The destroyer flotilla is inverted to its active side. This will cost us a total of 4 transport points for the land unit and 1 oil point for the destroyer. The force moves 1 hex to the Gilberts and their landing beaches. And this is going to be an unopposed landing. And the oil and transport points are moved accordingly. And next is going to be assembling our invasion force for Wake Island. This is going to involve 2 separate task forces, one from the Marianas and one from Iwo Jima. We'll activate our forces by flipping them to their active side. This will cost us a total of 4 transport points for the Special Naval Landing Force Brigade and 4 oil points for the light carrier Zuho and 2 destroyer escorts. Now it's important to note that an amphibious invasion can be up to 4 hexes away, but in order to have a valid target, you have to have a base somewhere within 2 spaces of your intended target. So in this case, Wake Island is a valid invasion point because we have a base in the Marshalls, which is 2 hexes away. The forces are placed into the task forces and they're moved towards their invasion zone. And when they arrive at Wake, they're kept in separate task forces. That's very important. Now you'll note that Wake Island has a land-based air unit, so when the invasion forces entered the adjoining hexes, they are allowed to go 1 extra hex and get to an invasion zone, so that's a legal move. And we move the transport and oil markers accordingly. This leaves the Japanese with 29 transport and 37 oil remaining. Now we want to secure some of those strategic resource hexes, an example of which is Brunei. You'll see the oil symbol up in the upper left-hand corner. We're going to use a force from Palau, consisting of the cruiser Mogami, destroyer, escort, and the Kawaguchi Brigade. Those forces will be activated. That will cost us a total of 4 transport and 3 oil. The units are assembled into a task force and move towards their landing beaches. And I have one force remaining, and that's going to be the Singapore Invasion Force. That is going to be centered on the naval base at Hainan, and it's going to consist of the 25th Army, the battleship Congo, heavy cruiser Mayoko, and a destroyer escort screen. The units in Hainan are activated. It's going to cost us a total of 16 transport points for the 25th Army and 7 oil points for the battleship, cruiser, and destroyer units. The units are assembled into a task force and move to their landing beaches on the Malaya Peninsula. And that will bring the operations phase to a close. Our next phase is the non-phasing player's reaction movement. As a part of the scenario rules, the British and US naval forces are prohibited from using reaction movement. However, there are 2 other independent forces that may be used. There is a Dutch force in Surabaya and an Australian force in Brisbane. Now, the Australian force is badly outnumbered with that Rabaul invasion force. They would be going up against a heavy cruiser and destroyer escorts. So that reaction probably would be a little bit too hasty. However, I think the Dutch would have a chance on opposing this landing in Brunei, and that being a resource hex would be an important thing to do. So the Dutch are going to activate their forces in Surabaya. And that's going to consist of the light cruiser De Ruyter and a destroyer flotilla. They're going to form a task force in Surabaya. And they're able to react up to 1/2 their movement rating. Both of the ships are rated at a speed of 8, so that would allow them to react up to 4 spaces away. They're going to react 2 spaces to the north-northeast and move into the Brunei hex, where they're going to oppose that landing. The next step is the air commitment phase, and that's where the phasing player will determine how his land-based air units are going to be committed for the coming combats. Japanese are going to commit 2 very large land-based air formations, one from Formosa and one from Saigon, and those will support the landings in Manila and Singapore. And to indicate that, we take the air units that we want to commit and move them to the hex side adjoining the base as to where they're going to be committed. If they were going to be committed in the base that they're at, they would remain in the center of the hex. We'll do the same for the Saigon force as well. And now we come to the combat phase. And now with the combat phase, the Japanese are able to select the order at which these combats will be processed. As a part of the scenario special rules, Rule 4, the U.S. has an aircraft carrier task force on pre-war ordered mission. That consists of the aircraft carriers Lexington and Saratoga, along with the heavy cruiser Northampton and 2 destroyer escort flotillas. Now, we have to make a die roll to determine the placement of this special force. I'll bring that table up on the screen, and then we're going to make a die roll to determine where it will appear. And the U.S. rolls a 5. And that is going to be appearing at Christmas Island. We'll place the force accordingly. And now with that done, we're going to continue on with the Day of Infamy, the Japanese strike on the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. We begin by placing the forces that are in the Pearl Harbor hex, both the Japanese attacking forces and the U.S. Pacific Fleet at station in Pearl Harbor. We place those on the battle board. We use a battle marker to mark the location of the battle on the map. We place the U.S. ground-based air formations in the air box, along with the land formations in the land box. And then we also have the U.S. Pacific Fleet that is at anchor, and those are going to go in the box ships at anchor. The Japanese fleet is a carrier task force, and that will be placed in the carrier task force box. Now, if we had multiple task forces, they would each be placed in a stack separately. It's very important to keep the task forces separate. The combat phase opens with a submarine attack step. In this step, the phasing and then non-phasing players would declare targets for task forces with submarines. Maximum of 1 sub point per task force. Now, the scenario rules indicate that the Allied forces have a -2 modifier to submarine attack hits during the first turn. As all combat is based on a success of a 5 or 6, this would eliminate any chance of the U.S. submarines striking the Japanese fleet as long as they have a destroyer escorting that task force. Now we're going to calculate our air points. The U.S. has 4 points of ground-based aircraft, so we're going to move the U.S. air points marker from 0 to 4. The Japanese task force has a total of 11 air points, 4 from the Akagi, 3 from the Hiru, and 4 from the Shokaku. That'll total 11 points, and we'll move the Japanese air points marker to 11. Now, a normal part of the air combat step of the battle segment allows the defender to use anti-aircraft. But per the scenario special rules, there will be no anti-aircraft for the Allies. This is due to the surprise nature of the Japanese strikes. So our first step is air combat, and we're going to roll a d6, a number of d6 equal to the number of air points we have, and for every 5 or 6, we're going to inflict a hit on the opposing air points. Now, as a part of this air-to-air combat, the Japanese will receive a +1 as a part of the turn 1 surprise. They'll gain +1 modifier for that. They'll also receive an extra +1 for air units from the Hiru and Akagi carriers, as those have elite pilots, and that's per that optional rule that is in place. In order to differentiate the different quality of planes that the Japanese will be attacking with, we're going to be rolling charcoal colored die for their standard aircraft and the red die for their elite pilots. The standard pilots will be adding +1 to the die, and the elite pilots will be adding +2. Okay, here's the roll. The elite pilots will hit on a 3, 4, 5, or 6. So that's going to produce a total of 5 hits there. And the non-elite pilots will be hitting on a 4, 5, or 6. So that's going to produce an additional 3 hits. More than enough to wipe out the U.S. air points on the ground. We've inflicted a total of 8 hits. Per the special rules, the Allied forces are unable to fight back, and those 4 points are automatically reduced to 0. And now we have 11 Japanese air points to 0 Allied points, which is going to produce Japanese air supremacy over the Hawaiian Islands. Now our remaining air points can target the units in the base, or task forces if there were those. We have ships at anchor, aircraft on the ground, and land units. Now it should note that those air points represent active forces. So in other words, the air combat that we did doesn't really destroy the air units, it just puts them out of action for the time of the battle. Now if we want to actually take these air units out, we'll have to target them with airstrikes. I'm going to use these cubes in order to differentiate between the different quality of the air crews that we have. The blue cubes are going to represent the elite pilots from the Akagi and from the Hiru, and the white ones will represent the standard pilots from the Shokaku. Now, as we are not going to be invading the Hawaiian Islands at this point, it won't make any sense to apply any attacking aircraft to the land units. So we're going to be limiting our carrier strikes to ships at anchor and aircraft on the tarmac. Now I've laid out the ships at anchor on Battleship Row so we can get an idea of what's available for us to attack. And I've decided to put 3 of my elite pilots and 1 standard pilot to go against the ground-based air units. And then we've deployed our elite pilots to attack the Battleship Row, and some of our lesser quality pilots will back them up, and I've also got 1 strike against a cruiser New Orleans. Now for each air point that we're assigning, we're going to roll a d6, and we're going to hit on a 5 or 6, but the Japanese are going to have some additional modifiers as well. And the Japanese forces that are going to be attacking Battleship Row are going to gain the following die roll modifiers. They're going to gain +1 because the Japanese have air supremacy. They'll gain +1 for targeting naval units at anchor. They'll also gain +1 for Japanese air points as a part of turn 1, the surprise attack, and also +1 for our elite air points. And then the attacks on the ground-based air units, those are going to gain the following modifiers: +1 for air supremacy, +1 for air points on Japanese part of turn 1, and +1 for any elite air points as a part of that attack. We'll resolve the attack on the airfields and the ground-based air. We're going to be rolling 3 red dice, simulating the elite formations, and 1 charcoal color die for the standard air units. So the elite pilots will be adding +3 to the die, while the standard pilots will be adding +2. Here's the roll. All 3 of the elite pilots have hit their mark, but unfortunately the standard pilots have missed. So that is going to cause a total of 3 points of damage to the air forces that are on the ground, reducing them from 4 down to a total of 1. Now we'll resolve the attacks on Battleship Row. We'll start with the attack on the Maryland, West Virginia. We're going to roll these individually. Our first roll will be the elite pilots. The elite pilots will be adding +4 to the roll, so that's going to be an automatic success. We'll roll it out anyway. Here's the first attack on the Maryland. It's a 2. We add 4 to that. That equals 6. And that'll be a hit on the Maryland, West Virginia. And now the standard pilots will make their run on the Maryland. They will succeed on any roll except a 1. They'll be adding 3 to the die. Roll a 5, that's an 8. And that's going to be another hit on the Maryland, West Virginia. These pilots have made their runs. Now the attack on the Pennsylvania and Arizona. The elite pilots will be an automatic hit. And now the non-elite pilots will roll their die. They will hit on anything except a 1. They're successful. 2 hits on the Pennsylvania and Arizona. Next is the attack on the California and Tennessee. That's also by an elite pilot, and that is going to produce an automatic hit. Next is the Nevada and Oklahoma. That also has an elite pilot assigned to it, producing a hit. And finally, the strike on the New Orleans. It's done by a standard pilot, and he will hit on any roll except a 1. He's adding 3 to the die roll. He rolled a 1, so that is a miss. The pilot has missed his target. And that's going to complete the airstrikes. And now to resolve damage, we're going to make a 2d6 roll for each hit that has been applied to these naval forces. And we're going to compare that modified roll to the unit's armor rating. You'll see a shield there, and in this case the Maryland and West Virginia have a 10. We're going to compare that value that we roll to that armor rating, and if we're able to equal or exceed that number, the ship will be sunk. If not, it is damaged. The first hit is going to get a modifier of +1 because it is an airstrike hit, and +1, it's an allied unit on the Japanese part of turn 1. The second hit is going to get a +1 for each hit over 1. So this first one is going to get a +2 modifier. Here's their roll. Rolled a 4, that's modified to a 6, which is a miss. So that's going to be, I should say it's damaged, but it's not sunk. We needed to have the roll equal or exceed the target's armor rating. So we'll mark the Maryland and West Virginia with 1 damage point. Now the second attack is going to gain an extra modifier, so we'll be rolling 2d6 and adding 3 to the result. Here's the roll. Rolled a 4, that's modified to a 7. So once again, that's just damage. The unit isn't sunk. We'll increase that damage value to 2. Now this is going to have an effect on how long it's going to take that vessel to be repaired. The more damage it has, the longer it will take to repair. We'll move on to the Pennsylvania and Oklahoma. First hit is going to be at a +2. And that vessel has a armor rating of 10. Here's the roll. Roll a 9. It's modified to an 11, and that's going to sink the Arizona. The other hit will be extraneous. The Arizona is sunk. We'll move on to the California and Tennessee. It's going to be at a +2 modifier. The armor rating of that vessel is 10. Here's the roll. Rolled a 5. That's modified to a 7, and that's going to indicate that the ship is just damaged. And finally, the last strike on the Nevada and Oklahoma will also be at a +2. Here's the roll. Rolled a 5, that's modified to a 7. Unfortunately, that does not equal or exceed the armor rating of the vessel, so it will also be damaged. We'll place a damage marker on that. So for the most part, this was a pretty much historical result of the Pearl Harbor attack. We have Pennsylvania and Arizona, which would be the Arizona, say, and the Oklahoma would be destroyed. And the other ships on Battleship Row some were damaged more than others. So this, combined with the ground attack, the attack on the ground-based air, was fairly consistent with the actual results of the battle. And there's no need for any sea control or land combat in this battle segment, so we're going to move on right to the administration phase, which is where the units will be returned to the battle hex. Damaged forces are going to be placed on the turn track a number of friendly reinforcement phases in the future equal to 2 times the number of damage points that they took. So in the case of the Maryland, West Virginia, that would appear 4 friendly reinforcement phases in the future. The California and the Nevada would appear 2 friendly reinforcement phases in the future. As the Allied player has not taken its turn yet, we would count the current reinforcement phase in the calculation. So that means that the Maryland, West Virginia will return on turn 4, while the California and Nevada will return on turn 2. And we'll place those on the turn track accordingly. So the Japanese forces are placed back in the battle hex, along with the defending forces, which we're placing in the Pearl Harbor storage box. It's the same as being in that same spot as Pearl Harbor. And that completes the first combat. Now, a combat on a turn other than turn 1 would include anti-aircraft fire and the ability of defending land-based aircraft to resolve the air-to-air combat simultaneously. But because of the surprise attack nature of the Japanese strike, they have many advantages on turn 1. And we'll continue resolving our combats, moving from east to west. Our next combat will be the battle for Wake Island. We'll transfer those forces to the battle board. We've transferred the forces to the battle board. We have 1 point of U.S. land-based aircraft, which is going to give the U.S. 1 air point. And we also have 2 points of Japanese carrier-based aircraft, which are based on the Zuho. That's a carrier task force. That's going to give Japan 2 air points. The invasion force, which is consisting of the Special Naval Landing Force Brigade, escorted by a destroyer, is placed in the Bombardment Task Forces box. These land units are considered naval units until they're actually landed. So our first step in resolving the combat is the air combat. We've calculated the amount of air points, and the Japanese will be able to use their surprise attack against the U.S. air points that are on Wake Island. The Japanese forces will be able to strike first, and that will be rolling 2d6, and they'll be gaining a +1 modifier for Japanese air points on turn 1. So we're going to be hitting that American air point on a result of 4 or greater. And here's the Japanese roll. They rolled a 5 and a 6. That's modified to a 6 and a 7. Those are 2 hits, and that is going to eliminate the American air points. That gives Japan air supremacy over Wake Island. Now remember, the air point has not been damaged yet. That has to be attacked in order to actually be damaged. This is just the results of the air combat, the tactical portion of that. Japan has 2 air points that they can apply to the strike force, and they will apply both of those to the land-based air on the ground at Wake. That'll allow them to roll 2 dice. Japanese will be rolling a d6 for each of the air formations from the Zuho, and they'll be able to add +2 to these. 1 for air supremacy, and 1 for the Japanese air point as a part of turn 1. So here is the roll. Japanese roll a 1 modified to a 3 and a 6 modified to an 8. That'll produce 1 hit, destroying the American land-based aircraft on Wake. And the Japanese are going to move their destroyer units into the sea control box, gaining control of the seas around Wake and allowing their land-based forces to land on the island. The Special Naval Landing Force Brigade is now in control of Wake Island. As there are no Allied land units in the opposite land box, we're going to place a occupied base marker on Wake Island. And all these forces will return back to the board. The Japanese forces are placed back on the board, and we keep them in their specific task forces. Those remain separate, so the carrier group and the destroyer escort for the amphibious invasion are in separate task forces. We keep those separate. And the Special Naval Landing Force now is placed on there along with that occupied base marker. Now we'll move on to the attack on the Gilberts. There is nothing opposing the Japanese here, so rather than placing this on the battle board, we're simply going to add that the Nankai Brigade will land on the Gilberts, and we're going to place a occupied base marker on the space to indicate that the Japanese have occupied the Gilbert Islands. And I should note that the victory points are not adjusted at this time. That happens at the end phase. A similar situation is going to occur at Rabaul. It's going to be an unopposed landing. So the Yachiki Brigade will land in Rabaul, and we're going to place an occupied base marker there as there are no Allied ground units in the hex. And now we're going to move on to the landings in the Philippine Islands at Manila. Those forces will be transferred to the battle board, and we'll place a battle marker in Manila. We've transferred the forces to the battle board. We have 2 points of American land-based air at Clark Airfield, General MacArthur's 6th Army in the Allied land box. We have a total of 8 factors of long-range aircraft from Formosa, and you'll notice that in the box it says divide by 2. Long-range air is always at half strength, so that will give us a total of 4 air points. Then we also have the invasion force consisting of the 14th Army along with a cruiser and destroyer escort. Those are placed in the bombardment task forces box. We'll adjust our air points accordingly. The U.S. has 2 air points. The Japanese have 4. We'll resolve the air-to-air combat with the Japanese surprise attack on Clark Field. They'll be rolling 4d6, a d6 for each of their air points, and they will hit on a roll of 5 or 6. Now the Japanese are eligible for a +1 modifier, and that is for a Japanese air point on turn 1. And here is their roll. And the Japanese have 3 hits. 2 of those are 7s and 1 6. And that is going to reduce the American air power from 2 down to 0. And that is going to give Japan air supremacy over Manila. And now we're going to allocate our airstrikes. And it's important for Japan to completely destroy any air forces on the island, because that air zone of control around Manila would prevent the transfer of oil from the Japanese resource points that would be available in the Western Pacific. And that would make it a kind of a problem for them to get that oil across. So it's important for us to totally annihilate that land-based air in Manila. So we're going to assign all 4 of our air points to ground attack of Clark Field. Now our airstrike is going to get the following modifiers. We're going to gain +1 because we have air supremacy, and we're also going to gain +1 because we are Japanese on turn 1 with our surprise attack. So we'll be gaining +2 to each of the die. Here's the roll. And we've rolled a total of all 4 hit. So that's going to completely annihilate the U.S. ground-based air at Clark Field. That's a good thing. Now we're going to move on to sea control. And in that case, we're going to assign the destroyer to move into the sea control box. There's nothing opposing him. So the Japan automatically gains control of the sea. That is going to allow them to land the 14th Army in Manila. Now you'll notice that we have another cruiser unit that has not been assigned to sea control, and that's in the bombardment box. We're going to use that to bombard the U.S. ground forces during the ground combat step. We're in the ground combat step now, and now we are at the subsection of ground support. We're going to be able to roll a d6 for each point of bombardment or air power that was assigned to the ground support mission. Now, we didn't assign any air units to that because we ended up placing them on the airfield attack, but we do have the heavy cruiser for Ataka. Now, that has a gunnery value of 1, so that will allow them to roll 1 die. And we'll see if we can have that hit the American ground forces. Here's the roll. Rolled a 6. So that is a hit, and that's going to assign 1 point of damage to the 6th Army. And we'll mark that accordingly. Our next step is to check supply. The player that has sea control has supply, and the opponent does not. So as we have taken control of the sea around Manila, the Japanese land forces are in supply, and MacArthur's 6th Army is unsupplied. And now we're going to conduct our ground combat. We compare our attacking force and defending force. The attacking force is going to roll a d6 for each point of ground force they have. The attacker's in supply, he's going to hit on a 5 or 6. The defending forces will roll 8 dice, but they're going to be at a -1 die roll modifier because they are unsupplied. So they're only going to hit on a 6. We'll start out with the Japanese 14th Army attack on MacArthur's 6th Army. We're going to roll 8 dice, and we're going to score a hit on 5 or 6. Here's the roll. Japan scores a total of 4 hits, and will mark the 6th Army with 4 hits. That brings the damage to the 6th Army up to 5 points. Now the U.S. forces will counterattack, and they'll also be rolling 8 dice, but they're only going to hit on a 6 because of the unsupplied status. Here's the U.S. roll. And the U.S. has scored no hits. They have no 6s. So that will conclude the ground combat. We're going to compare the number of hits that the phasing player received in comparison to those that the non-phasing player received. And in this case, the non-phasing player has received a total of 5 damage. Phasing player has received no damage. This is going to result in a victory for the attacker. The defending land unit is going to be inverted and reduced. Now, if the Japanese could have inflicted enough hits to exceed the combat value of the unit, they would have destroyed the unit completely. It would not have been reduced, it would have been eliminated. But that's not the case here. So we're going to return these forces back from the battle board back to the map, and we'll continue on with our combat phase. Those forces are returned to the map. We have the now damaged 6th Army, full strength 14th Japanese Army. The naval forces that transported the 14th Army are placed in a task force, and the ground-based or land-based air units from Formosa are returned to Formosa. And that's going to complete the combat at Manila. And now we're going to move on to our attack at Brunei. The forces have been deployed to the battle board. I've just spread these out. They're actually 1 task force each. The first step is going to be submarine attacks. Both players can commit submarines, and they can declare a target task force, 1 sub per task force. The Japanese are going to commit one of their sub points, so we will move the Japanese sub marker from 2 down to 1. The Dutch task force has destroyers, so they will be able to conduct anti-submarine warfare. There will be no modifiers to the roll. On a result of 5 or 6, they will have eliminated the submarine threat from their fleet. Here's the roll. They rolled a 1, so that's a failure. So the Japanese submarine has been able to get around the Dutch screen, and they're going to lay out a shot targeting the derouter. 5 or 6, a hit for the Japanese submarine. Here's the roll. They rolled a 2. That's a miss. Now the Allied submarine will move into position. The Japanese destroyers will attempt anti-submarine warfare. There'll be no modifiers to the roll. 5 or 6 will stop the attack. Here's the roll. They rolled a 3. That's a failure. So the Allied submarines have been able to avoid the Japanese screen, and they're going to set up for a torpedo attack. They are going to target the transports of the Kawaguchi Brigade. Now, Allied submarines are at a -2 modifier during turn 1, but they are targeting an air or land unit for +1. So in this case, the Allied submarines will inflict a hit on the Kawaguchi Brigade on a roll of 6. Here's the roll. 5, it was close, but they missed. We'll move on to the combat segment. Neither of the two sides has any air points, so we'll move on to the surface combat phase. The Dutch are going to move both of their ships into the sea control box, as will the Japanese. The Kawaguchi Brigade on their transports will remain in the screen area. Now, there is an optional rule that is in place. It's called long lance torpedoes, and it reads, in the first surface combat round of any surface combat step, any Japanese cruiser or destroyer units are considered to have 2 firepower instead of their printed values. These values revert in subsequent surface combat rounds during the same surface combat step. Now, as neither player has any air points in play, we have to make a die roll, and that will determine who has air superiority. Even though neither force has any air points, we still need to determine who would have that, and that would be based upon, perhaps a seaplane on one of the cruisers or a scout plane or whatever that would represent. So we're going to roll a die, and the high roller is going to have air superiority. Here's the roll. In this case, the Allies have air superiority, so we will mark that accordingly. This allows the player with air superiority to do the matchups between the units. So the Dutch could either have the De Ruyter go against the Mogami or the Kagero. I think they'll leave it as we have it, cruiser against cruiser, destroyer against destroyer. I'm going to bring the surface combat table up on the screen, and this is what we will use to determine our surface combat resolution. Now, as we've stated before, the Japanese have the advantage of the long lance torpedo, and so their combat values were going to be, each of those will be rated as a 2 for the first round. Surface combat works as follows. We take the firepower of the firing ship and compare that to the armor rating of the target. So in this case, the De Ruyter attacking the Mogami is a firepower of 1 versus a 9. That gives us a number. In this case, it's 5. So for the Dutch to score a hit on the Mogami cruiser, they'll need a 5 or greater. Here is the roll. Rolled a 4, and that's a miss. Now the Dutch destroyer will fire. That has a firepower of 0 against a defense rating of 8, which will produce another 5 is what is needed. Target value is 5. Here's the roll. He rolled a 6. That's going to score a hit on the Japanese destroyer. Now the Japanese will fire. This is all done simultaneously. And once again, the Japanese, both forces have a value of 2. So the Mogami is going to fire on the De Ruyter. That'll be a firepower rating of 2 versus a 8 defense rating, which will produce a 3. So on a roll of 3 or greater, the Mogami will hit the De Ruyter. Here's the roll. He rolled a 3. That's a hit. The Dutch cruiser is struck. And now the Japanese destroyers will target the Dutch destroyers. That'll be a value firepower 2 against a armor value of 8. And once again, that's going to be a 3 or greater. Here's the roll. That's a miss. All right, now we're going to resolve the damage of that first round of attacks. We'll resolve the hit on the derouter. We're going to be rolling 2 dice, and we're going to compare that roll with the target's armor rating. Japanese will qualify for a +2 modifier. That's the attacking firepower of the surface ship. They'll also qualify for +1 for an allied unit on a Japanese part of turn 1. So they'll be getting a total of 3 points, a dice roll modifier. Here's the Japanese roll. They rolled a 3. That's modified to a 6, and that will not exceed the armor rating. So the derouter is still afloat. It's damaged, but it is still afloat. We'll mark that vessel with 1 hit. Now the Dutch destroyers will fire on the Japanese destroyers. And they have no modifier there. The attacking firepower of the ship is a 0, and they will not qualify for any other modifiers. So we're going to roll 2 dice and find out the result. We need to get an 8 or greater to exceed the armor rating of the Japanese destroyers. Here's the roll. They rolled a 7. It's close, but not quite. So that will damage the Japanese destroyers. We'll mark that with a damage marker. The damage forces are removed, and they'll be placed on the turn track. Number of turns equal to 2 times the number of damage points the ship's received. So in this case, the derouter and the Japanese destroyer will appear 2 reinforcement cycles in the future. I did check in the rules, and there is a special rule for the Dutch forces. If a Dutch naval vessel is damaged, it's removed from the game. So in this case, the derouter is considered to be like sunk, and the Japanese destroyer will be moved to turn 3. And we'll start a new round of surface combat. They're formed into groups, so the Dutch destroyer and the Japanese cruiser will match up against each other. And now, starting with the team that has no air superiority, which would be the Japanese, they can declare a withdrawal. Japanese will not. Then the Dutch are eligible to withdraw if they choose. They're going to stay and fight this out. So the Dutch destroyers are going to target the cruiser. They have a combat value of 0 against a armor value of 9. They're going to need a 6 in order to hit. So it's a very low probability, but the Dutch are brave. Here's the roll. The roll of 5. It's close, but it's a miss. Now the Japanese will roll. They're going to be using their gunnery factor of 1 versus a armor value of 8, which will produce a value of 4. So Japanese will need a 4 or greater to hit. We rolled a 6, and that's a hit on the Dutch destroyer. Japanese are going to roll 2 dice, and they're going to check to see if they have damaged or sunk that Dutch destroyer. They're going to receive a +1 modifier for being an allied unit on Japanese part of turn 1, and they'll also receive +1 for the attacking firepower of the Mogami. So they'll be adding 2 to the result. Here's the roll. They rolled a 5. That's modified to a 7, which does not sink the ship, but because this is a Dutch ship and it is damaged, it will be considered to be sunk, as they have no repair facilities in the Dutch East Indies of any amount to speak of. So that means that the Japanese are in control of the sea around Brunei that will allow them to land the Kawaguchi Brigade and take possession of that location. That will allow the Japanese to place a occupied base marker on the Brunei location. All these Japanese units will return to the board. All right, the Japanese forces will return. The battle marker will be removed. And Japan has occupied Brunei. The next battle is going to be unopposed, and that's the Japanese 15th Army has moved into the neutral base of Bangkok, and they're going to take possession of that. There are no Allied forces there to oppose them, so we'll be placing a occupied base marker in Bangkok. And we have one final battle to resolve, and that is going to be the Japanese attack on the Malayan Peninsula, specifically in Singapore. We'll move those forces to the battle board. Our final combat to resolve is the Battle of Singapore. We have the British Malayan Army, and we have two vessels in ships at anchor, the Repulse and Prince of Wales, and a C-class destroyer. The Japanese have 4 fleets of long-range aircraft that total 8 points, and because those are long-range aircraft, they're only at half strength, so that'll be 4 air points. We'll mark those accordingly. British have no air points, so the Japanese automatically will have air supremacy. So we are able to assign our 4 air points to attack base elements at Singapore, either the ships at anchor or the Malayan Army. And I think what we'll do is I'm going to apply 3 of the land-based air points towards a port attack on the Prince of Wales, and I'll apply 1 air point in ground support. That'll be resolved during ground combat, but these attacks will resolve right now. So we'll be rolling 3d6. We'll be hitting on a result of a 5 or 6 for the attack on the Prince of Wales, and the following modifiers will apply. We're going to gain +1 because we have air supremacy, +1 because the target is a naval unit at anchor, +1 for a Japanese air point during turn 1, and so that'll allow us +3 to the die. Okay, and here is the roll. We'll be hitting on 5s or 6s. We have a +3 to each die. And the Japanese have scored a total of 2 hits. So 2 hits on the Prince of Wales port. Now we'll resolve the effects of the damage of the 2 hits on the Prince of Wales. The first hit will be able to, we're going to roll 2d6, and we need to meet or exceed an armor value of 10. Modifiers to the roll will be +1 for an airstrike hit, and +1 for an allied unit on Japanese part of turn 1. Okay, here's the roll. We'll be adding 2 to the result. Rolled a 7. That's modified to a 9. That's not enough to exceed that armor rating, so that vessel will be damaged, and we'll put 1 damage marker on the Prince of Wales. Now this next hit that will resolve is going to get an additional +1 modifier, and that's +1 for each hit over 1. So now we'll be getting a +3 modifier to this roll. Okay, here is the roll. Rolled a 9, that's modified to a 12, and that exceeds the Prince of Wales's armor factor, and the ship is sunk. We'll move on to the sea control phase, and the Japanese will move the destroyer into the sea control area. That will wrest sea control for the Japanese, keeping their forces in supply, and the British forces will now be unsupplied. Now that the Japanese have wrested control of the sea, the 25th Army will land in Singapore. And now we're going to resolve our ground support. Now we have 1 point of error in a ground support roll, and we also have 3 gunnery factors between the battleship Congo and the heavy cruiser Mayoko. Those will also be adding into the gunfire support, ground support in against that Malayan army. So we're going to be rolling a total of 4 dice, 1 for the aircraft, 3 for the naval gunfire, and we'll see if there's any modifiers to that. There is a modifier of +1. Player has air supremacy and air point providing ground support, and that's true. All right, so we are going to roll a total of 4 dice. And we'll be getting a +1 modifier. Here's the roll. And we rolled a total of 2 hits. So that will apply 2 damage to the Malayan army. Now we'll do our supply check, and as the Japanese have sea control, they will be in supply, and the British Malayan army will be unsupplied. Now we'll resolve our ground combat. We have the 25th Japanese Army with 8 strength points. They'll be rolling a total of 8 dice, and they will be inflicting a hit on the Malayan army for each 5 or 6 that they roll. Okay, here is their roll. And they rolled a total of 4 hits. It's a good roll, 4 hits. So we will mark them with a total of 4 damage points. That brings the damage level on the Malayan army up to 6. Now the Malayan army will roll, and they are unsupplied, so they are only going to score hits on a result of 6. And here's their roll. And they ended up scoring a total of 2 hits. They have 2 6s. That will put 2 damage points onto the 25th Army. And we compare the amount of damage inflicted on each army, and the British Malayan Army has taken 6 points of damage. The Japanese 25th has only taken 2. So in this case, the phasing player's hits are greater than the non-phasing player's hits. All non-phasing player units are damaged. Full strength land unit is reduced. So we're going to flip the Malayan army to its reduced side. And that will conclude the combat in Singapore. The Japanese have landed in Singapore, but they have not wrested control yet. They need to eliminate the Malayan army. We'll move those forces back to the map. And those forces are returned to the map, and that's going to conclude our combat phase. We'll move on to the return to base phase. All right, in this phase, all naval units that were activated during the turn will return to their main bases. And those units will revert to their deployment site. So we're going to move all of the forces back to the main bases, and then we will continue on. All of the forces have returned to Kure for the Japanese, and the only activated Allied forces was that reactionary carrier force of the Lexington that returned to the United States West Coast. And now we're going to mark each base that had a occupied base marker on them and convert them to Japanese control. In this case, the occupied base marker in Bangkok is removed and a white cube is placed there to indicate Japanese control. We'll do the same thing with Brunei, and the same thing with Rabaul, as well as the Gilbert Islands, and also with Wake Island. Both Manila and Saigon are remaining contested zones because both sides have ground units there. And now we'll move on to the second deployment phase. The phasing player can again redeploy units during this part of the turn. All the rules for the first deployment phase apply, with the following two exceptions. Any land or air unit that was used during operational movement cannot deploy again, and one hex deployment is not allowed in the second deployment phase. And I think the only thing I'm going to do is spend one transport point and use that to activate a Japanese destroyer in Kure. We'll move that 4 hexes. And I'm going to move that destroyer from its base in Kure 4 points. 1, 2, 3, 4 into Truk. And now it's the end phase. We're going to adjust the victory point markers to reflect the Japanese conquests. Japan gained victory point for Bangkok, 1 for Brunei, 1 for Rabaul, 1 for the Gilbert Islands, and 1 for Wake. So that's a total of 5 victory points that will move the Japanese from 20 up to 25 victory points. That will complete the Japanese turn, and we'll continue on with the Allied turn next.